into session number 12 of Biblical Backgrounds. I'm Dr. John McMath, joined by my friends in Italy and the Philippines and some here in this country. And today we'll be continuing with a study of the archaeology and geography and literature and all kinds of other stuff that provides us with a background for the Bible. We've made the point that if the Bible is true, it is connected by a virtually infinite web to thousands and thousands of trivial details. There are lots of things that are true as they relate to one another. The Bible is like that. And so today we'll be looking at King Solomon. Solomon doesn't exist in a vacuum. Solomon is the son of David by Bathsheba. And we studied that last time. Solomon reigned probably 40 years, and we have really good numbers and lots of detail about the kingdom during the time of Solomon. I'm going to give you just little bits and pieces to kind of fill it in. I want you to understand some of the stuff that is going on here. Some of it is actually surprising. You wonder, did they get this wrong? What's the deal? But the Bible gives us remarkable hints, and in the process, we develop greater and greater understanding of what life was really like in biblical times. So we'll move on to Solomon. Let me share the screen if I can ever find it. Bingo, there it is. And that should come up. Yes, it does. Solomon's kingdom and the succession from David. We sometimes call the whole story of Saul and David and Solomon the accession narrative, not the succession, but the accession narrative, how David came to power and how the Davidic kingly line began. That's an important part of the biblical history because the kingly line is the messianic line. And as we're tracking the lineage of Christ, we end up looking at the kingly line and tracking who was king where and when. The kingdom is going to divide into a northern and southern element after the time of Solomon. So Solomon is the last king of a united Israel. Nevertheless, Jerusalem will continue from the time of David down to the present day as the capital of Israel. Jerusalem was the capital just of Judah for quite a while. Okay, the succession from David to Solomon, as you might expect, was not without lots of politics and intrigue. You would think it would be simple. The firstborn son of the king ought to be the next king. In a dynastic system, that's the way it works. The problem is that David had multiple wives, at least 8 wives that we know of, and heaven only knows how many concubines or royal diplomatic wives. And we've talked about this last time. That makes for an extraordinarily complex household. The ancient world invented the harem, kind of a residential complex for the interrelated families of the king. in an ancient harem. Hollywood always gets it wrong. I don't watch much that comes out of Hollywood anymore, but back in the day, they would show a harem, and it'd be the Sultan and a couple of court eunuchs, and a bunch of dancing girls, feeding him grapes and whatnot. The real thing was much more complex than that. Every wife came with servants. Wives ended up having children. Wives sometimes came with extended family. Everybody needed a place to live, separate apartments, rooms within the palace. And so palaces grew to be very large. The family quarters as a whole were known as the harem. And this was a place not just for the slave girls for parties, but for the king's family, all the extended relationships that exist within a family like that. And the children of these various wives and others within the household were always interacting. That's much of the intrigue and the tragedy of David's career can be tracked to that. Now, the same thing is going to be true with Solomon. Solomon also had multiple wives and concubines and diplomatic connections. All of that is going on. When David was in the process of dying, everybody knew that this was going to be his time. And David and Bathsheba had decided ahead of time, and they had announced this to the court, that Solomon, the son of David by Bathsheba, would be the next king. However, David had another son whose name was Adonijah, who tried to usurp the throne. And I've forgotten who Adonijah's mother was, but one of the concubines. This is the kind of thing that happens. Solomon found out what was going on. Actually, as the story is told there in Second Kings, Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, found out what was going on, and told Solomon, told everybody, and the plot was ended. Adonijah realized that he had been found out and was in trouble, and he ran to the tabernacle, which at that time was up on the threshing floor that would become the Temple Mount. And there we're told that he clung to the horns of the altar. Now, I wanted to show you an altar with horns. This was the only one I could find conveniently. Something to understand, just a fun fact, is that altars come in all different shapes and sizes. The typical altar in the ancient world is not a standard size. There's no one size fits all. Every god in every religion in the ancient world had a different size and shape altar. This particular altar is in a temple to, I believe, Zeus on the island of Delos out in the Greek islands. There's a temple there with this marble altar out front. So that's a horn, or set of 4 horns bolted onto the top of this altar. The altar in question would have been a bronze altar. The bronze altar would have looked like a like a big bronze basket or welded thing, because the top would have to have been a screen. The fire would have been built underneath, and the ashes would have fallen through the screen. An animal could be put on top for the burning. The bronze altar was actually a portable altar. It was lightweight enough that 4 men or 8 men could carry it. And grabbing a hold of the horns of the altar, of any altar in any temple in the ancient world, would have been an act of claiming sanctuary. And in Adonijah's case, that didn't help. He grabbed the altars, but he was done in anyway. It just didn't work. So anyway, that's an altar. Solomon, after this is, nasty event is cleared up, claimed the throne. Now, a throne is the symbol, one of several symbols of a king's authority. This particular throne actually belongs to the Catholic Archbishop of Ravenna. Those of you in Ravenna might want to go to the museum sometime and see this particular ivory throne. It's real ivory. Those panels are actual carved ivory. The blank ones are replacement panels because the throne was once broken. But it's a very expensive, one-of-a-kind item. Kings have that sort of thing. They don't sit in it for extended periods because it's uncomfortable to sit in a box like that. But it's a symbol of the power of the king. Adonijah was pardoned by Solomon, apparently, but afterwards he made the mistake of asking for the hand of a young lady named Abishag to be his wife. Abishag was one of David's concubines. Solomon took this for treason and ordered his death right on the spot. A king can do that. And Adonijah would have done the same to Solomon had he had the opportunity. Okay, Solomon's internal affairs are fairly well known. We've actually found a bunch of background. The most important thing that Solomon is remembered for is the construction of the temple. You'll recall that David actually wanted to build a temple, but Solomon is the one who got the permission to build the thing. God told David, when did I ever tell you that I was tired of living in my tent? When did I ever ask for a house to live in? So the temple was not a necessary thing, but with the growth of the kingdom, the symbol of God's presence in the midst of it all is a pretty important thing. And Solomon had the honor of building the temple. Now, you'll notice in this photograph, the pretty lady in the foreground is my wife. That's Donna, and I still remember that dress. Mm-hmm. I don't imagine you still have that. That's long gone. Anyway, this photograph is taken on the Temple Mount. That pavement that we're walking on is most likely medieval, mostly medieval. The thing in the background is called the Dome of the Rock. Dome of the Rock is simply the one of the 2 Muslim mosques that is built up on the old Temple Mount. The little dome just to Donna's left is called the Dome of the Tablets. And we'll come back to that just a second. I don't think I have a diagram, but the Dome of the Tablets is an interesting part of a larger argument for the location of Solomon's temple. We ask ourselves the question, if the temple is going to be rebuilt, does that mean that the Dome of the Rock will have to be bulldozed first? And the simple answer is no, not really. Now, I would think that it would probably be a good idea to bulldoze the Dome of the Rock. I wouldn't mind getting rid of it. But it is historical, so maybe they should leave it there. The temple probably sat over the top of that lead roofed dome there on the right, the Dome of the Tablets. And we'll talk about that as we get a little farther into this. Let me show you some pictures from the Temple Mount area. This is a view from the south, actually from Paratroopers Road, which is one of the back roads to Bethlehem. And this photograph was taken in the old days, like longer than 20 years ago, when it was possible to actually drive from Jerusalem to Bethlehem without going through checkpoints. It was really rather nice. But this is a view from the south. You can see, of course, the big golden dome is the Dome of the Rock. Just to the right of that golden dome is a smaller dome over what is called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that mosque is up against the south wall of the Temple Mount compound. And that long wall that you see is the southern wall of the Temple Mount. The hillside that projects directly toward the camera is the sometimes called the ophel, or it's a Hebrew word that means a tongue. And it's a tongue-shaped piece of ground that was the original location of the city of Jerusalem. This is the original Jebusite city, and this is also the location of the city of David. So David had his palace on the northern end of the ophel, but south of the Temple Mount. Okay, let's see here. There's the Dome of the Rock. It was built in the 600s. For people who wonder, they look at this thing and they assume, well, this is the old temple, but it isn't. It's a Muslim dome. It was built by a character named Muawiyah, who was actually a heretic Syrian Christian. It probably held a position very similar to the modern Jehovah's Witnesses or Iglesia Ni Cristo in the Philippines. He taught that Christ was merely human, not divine, and that God is one. The unity of God was their key thing. Muawiyah is one of the forerunners of the religion that would later on become Islam. The Dome of the Rock was erected about 200 years before the Quran was ever made public. We don't know if there was an earlier version. They claim that there was, of course, but there's no evidence of that. Some of the writing on the Dome of the Rock ends up in the Quran, but it's not the same thing. The Dome of the Rock came first, the Quran comes later. The writing here is primarily directed against Christians. Anyone who would claim that God has an associate is a heretic, an evil person, is what the Dome of the Rock is all about. Another view of it, the gold anodized aluminum, which is what that roof is made of these days, was added after 1967. The Muslims wanted to make sure everybody understood that that Jerusalem is the third most holy place in Islam, even though Muhammad didn't live there. Muhammad never did anything there. Nobody Muslim ever did anything there until the invaders came to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, it's a very important place, and Palestinians are very important people, and everybody needs to be really upset because the Israelis are in town. The buildings in the background there are kind of fun. That's the uh, uh, Arab quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. Until you get way off into the distance, that's the King David Hotel. Very, very big hotel in that part of town. Another view, the pavement and the steps. Other features that are visible on the surface of the Temple Mount today date to the medieval period, a time of Suleiman the Magnificent. Here's that little dome again. This is called the Dome of the Tablets in Arabic. And you say, tablets? What tablets are those? It's built over a solid piece of limestone. And the name of this thing is traditionally associated with the Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant, just what it sounds like. The covenant is the 10 commandments, 2 tablets that contain God's law. The Ark of the Covenant was set in the tabernacle and later on in the temple on a pedestal within the Holy of Holies. Some scholars have argued that this solid limestone piece of pavement is actually the pedestal within the Holy of Holies that once held the Ark of the Covenant, and thus the old name. Now, the problem is this is an Arabic name, and the dome itself was built by the Arabs in the 7th century. So how did they know? How reliable is the tradition? Well, let's look at something else. This shot is the eastern gate of the old city of Jerusalem. This shot is taken actually from the Garden of Gethsemane. You can see some flowers on the right that are part of the garden. If you were to draw a line directly east-west, we're at the eastern gate, and if we draw a line due west, up over the top of the Temple Mount and down the other side, you would find on the other side a small private gate that's been excavated in the wall on the western side. And that gate is known from the inscriptions and other things that we have, documents like Josephus, as the priest's gate. There was a gate from the main city of Jerusalem up onto the Temple Mount that only the priests would take. They could go from their homes directly up onto the Temple Mount into the back of the temple. If you draw a line from the eastern gate to the priest's gate, you'll find that that line directly intersects the Dome of the Tablets. There's other elements underground that are very difficult to get at. Archaeologists are not allowed to touch anything on the Temple Mount. But from time to time, the Muslims have done landscaping and retaining walls and whatnot, and have briefly exposed bits of the underlying stone. And from that and from careful measurements of photographs, it's been possible to reconstruct the original layout of the Temple Mount. And that supports the idea that the original temple was not over the side of the Dome of the Rock, but rather about 100 meters to the south of that spot. So this shot, you can see the eastern gate, and to the left of the eastern gate is that dome. And that's the top of the dome of the rock itself. You can see how a straight line from the eastern gate doesn't intersect the dome. It intersects the platform of the tablets. So that's an argument that we make. It doesn't, who cares? Eventually the temple will be built in Jerusalem, and it will probably be prefab, because the next one that will go up will be during the 7-year tribulation period, and it will be desecrated. This shot was taken inside the Dome of the Rock. By the way, that's not permitted. You're not even allowed to carry a camera into the Dome of the Rock. So this is a photograph that I purchased as a set from a Muslim shop. But they're allowed to take pictures, the rest of us aren't. But you'll notice there's a rock there in the foreground. That's the initial rock. And it's uneven, it's a bit of limestone. It has a hole in the middle that when you walk in, which I don't recommend, I did it once, and discovered that the chamber inside this rock is an important part of the mosque. It's called the Well of the Spirits. And this is a place where Muslim women go to pray that they might become pregnant. And so it's kind of like, it's just like walking into the ladies' restroom. It's kind of embarrassing for a man to walk in there. So I don't recommend it. If you're ever in Jerusalem and the Dome of the Rock happens to be open, don't go in there. It's kind of, it's a place you retreat from rapidly. At one time, that was a Bronze Age Canaanite tomb. The shape is exactly that of the Bronze Age shaft tomb. It's very, very unlikely that Solomon would have allowed nuts. There it is, and I can see that that's not happening. That is so frustrating. That means the hyperlinks aren't working. Folks, I'm sorry, there's a bunch of pictures that I'm talking about here that are not showing for you. The stone, the dome that is built over this rock is not any part of the original temple. The Muslims, of course, claim that this was the very stone that Muhammad visited in his famous night vision, his night visit to Jerusalem in Surah 19 of the Quran. And the Quran, of course, doesn't say that he went to Jerusalem, but it doesn't matter. Muslims all believe that it has to have been Jerusalem. And they even built the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Let me see if I can get there. Here we are, back to the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Tablets. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There in the background, I've got an interior shot here that may give you a little better idea. Solomon built a lot of important buildings in and around the Temple Mount area. None of those exist today. When we look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we see a kind of a hint of what the porticoed buildings might have been like. The interior of the Al-Aqsa Mosque has a whole bunch of marble. And you see these marble columns, the magnificent Corinthian capitals on the columns. Those actually date back to shortly after the time of Constantine. Those were a part of a church that the old Christians of Jerusalem called the New Church. The old church was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre around the tomb of Christ. The new church was a great big basilica church, a very, very large church, built in the old city of Jerusalem. That was knocked down. It was demolished by the Muslims, who then built the Al-Aqsa Mosque from those ruins. And this is the evidence of that. You can see the stone. The rugs on the floor are a place for Muslims to pray, and it's a fairly important site in Jerusalem. The term Al-Aqsa means the furthest. The Quran says that Muhammad went to the furthest mosque in order to pray there, along with his magic horse, whose name is Barak, or lightning. So Muhammad rode his faithful horse Lightning all the way to the furthest mosque. Muslims decided that the furthest mosque had to be in Jerusalem. And so, quick like bunnies, after they finally conquered the place, they built a mosque so that Muhammad would be right. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was built at some point after the Dome of the Rock. And that kind of fills in some details. I tell you some of this history so that you understand that the Bible is different than the Quran. The Bible reports actual history and actual background. And when we dig up actual rocks, we see the evidence for the background that the Bible actually claims. The Quran has to make it up as it goes along. That's the difference between a truth and a lie. And here we see the evidence of the lie. At any rate, Muhammad's night vision reports a trip that didn't happen. This is an interesting bit of Solomon's construction. And it's kind of a fun thing. This is the straight joint. And people who do masonry work, like the church in Manalaun, you start laying bricks. One of the things that you don't want to do with bricks is to make a straight joint. Bricks are always laid so that they don't so that the joints don't overlap. You notice too on the right side of this this picture of big blocks, those blocks are kind of laid out in an order so that the straight verticals don't line up, except right in the middle. And you notice how the rocks to the right kind of have raised centers. We call them raised bosses. And off to the left, those stones seem to be more carefully cut. It's obvious to everybody looking at this picture that the stones to the left were added to the stones to the right. The stones to the right come first. If I had another picture here, which I don't, I could back you up 100 meters or so, and you would see that those stones to the right are a short exposure. It's about 10 meters high that we can see in this picture, and about 25 meters long before it gets covered up by it's buried in the hillside. That little exposure is all that's left on this side of Solomon's Temple Mount enclosure. The stones to the left were added by Herod. When Herod the Great built the Temple Mount, he built it bigger than Solomon had done. So we actually have stones that date back to the time of Solomon. Those are Solomon's stones. We see the same kind of construction in other places around Israel when we begin digging in other places, like Megiddo, for example. Here's a building that's often called Solomon's Stables. It's more likely this was Solomon's storehouse. Solomon fortified cities at Megiddo, Gezer, and Hatzor. I'm not going to take you all of those places, but when we go to Megiddo and Gezer and Hatzor, we can still find the walls that date to the time of Solomon. How do we know those are Solomon's walls? Two things. One, we can see the kinds of stones that were used and the way they were shaped, which is characteristic of the time of Solomon. The Bible specifically says that these cities were fortified. When we go to those cities, we find exactly what the Bible says is supposed to be there. These places have palaces, they have gates, they have walls, they have water systems, they have storage buildings like this. Rather than a stable, this is probably a storage building. And all of Solomon's structures are easily datable with what we call ceramic dating, pottery dating. Whenever a wall is built, it is necessary to fill the wall up with rubble. And the rubble often includes pottery, broken pieces of pottery that date to the period of time when the wall was built. How do we know when Solomon's walls were built? Well, we find pottery that dates to the 10th century BC. And that's actually not hard. That's not difficult to do. So what is the evidence that Solomon was the king? Well, there's lots of evidence. Literally lots of evidence. It's all over the place. Let's look at some one gateway complex. We're just going to look at this one. This is at Megiddo. And again, you can see great big blocks, no particular borders around the bosses. So the boss is not exposed. The stones are larger than the earlier kinds of gates that we see in Israel. Those Canaanite gateway complexes tended to be random shaped rocks. These tend to be cut stones. Solomon used what's called ashlar blocks, great big stones, interspersed with smaller stones, but lots of great big stones. This is just one example. We have similar gates at Hatzor and at Gezer, which were also built at the time of Solomon. There are later gates also from other kings that allow us to contrast and compare. Solomon did other things outside of Jerusalem. One of the most interesting was the mining. We're told that Solomon mined for copper. Now, the copper mining was important. Copper is valuable for a lot of things in the ancient world. It was used for jewelry, but its most important use was added to tin to make bronze. Bronze was a fairly hard, tough material that was useful for a variety of things, a lot of utensils. By the time of Solomon, iron was being used for weapons and for sharp edges, but bronze was still a very valuable material. This area, the Timna Valley in the south of the Arabah, is just north of Eilat. Eilat is the Israeli vacation spot today. Frankly, there's nothing to go to in Eilat. I don't like the place. There is a Christian youth hostel in Eilat, and my Moody group stayed there 1 year. And we had fun there. It was nice. We got to know the people there, and they have special programs for particularly African immigrants to Israel, and that was fun. But the rest of Eilat is just it's a tourist trap, just a big tourist trap. And I think of it as a shopping mall on the beach with taverns. So I don't care for it very much, but some people really like Eilat. Just north of Eilat is a very, very dry area, rugged area. This Timna Valley is essentially waterless. It's a very, very difficult place to live. In order to do what Solomon did here, he had to import people. Now, this picture is interesting because it's a photograph of Egyptian workmen in the Timna copper smelting camp. Okay, the Egyptians were here before Solomon was. We have evidence that there were Egyptian mines in the Sinai and well into the Negev region, the wilderness of Paran, from the time of Abraham at least. The Israelites very likely were involved in the copper mining in the Sinai. One of the reasons that some of us believe that Mount Sinai in the south of the Sinai Peninsula is the correct location for Mount Sinai is because of the copper mines nearby. We know from the inscriptions that were found there that Hebrew-speaking people were among the workmen at the copper mines in Sinai. It is demonstrated now that the earliest alphabetic system, a system with 23 or 26 letters instead of 2,000 pictograms, was invented by the Hebrews at the mining camps in the Sinai. The oldest inscriptions we have in Hebrew are from those Egyptian mining camps, the oldest that we can realistically identify as Hebrew. So there's a close relationship between Hebrew letters and the hieroglyphics, as well as the Akkadian letters. It all comes together. But this mining, let me show you just another picture, give you an idea of the barrenness of this thing. There's a young man there sitting in front of a bit of an archaeological find, a bit of a smelter foundation. In order to do what Solomon did, he would have to have kept a team of workmen out in the desert. It would have involved a crew of between 1,000 and 2,000 men living out in the desert. There's no water here. Solomon would have to have provided the logistic train for water and food and the equipment needed to do the mining operation. This was a major thing. This is something that you don't just walk out into the desert and mine for copper. It's a major project We find a dozen or more sites all over the Sinai Peninsula that were used earliest by the Egyptians and then by Solomon. The Bible specifically claims that Solomon had mining interests in this part of the world. Here they are. Okay, maintaining government. Government is expensive. The bigger your government, the more it costs. If you're going to run copper mines in the Negev, you've got to have a big government with lots of income, because a big government means lots of government workers, and those government workers have to be fed and housed and kept in a manner to which they've become accustomed. Government bureaucracies are the same everywhere in the world, and they're all expensive. Not everything that Solomon did was worth doing, but whatever he did the most expensive way possible, because that's how government always works. Here is a government storage facility far in the north of Israel. This place is Hatzor in the far north, about 15 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee, right on the international trade route. Now, I've shown you some pictures of Hatzor. This is yet another picture of Hatzor. This particular storage building has since been completely picked up and moved to another spot. The archaeologists wanted to look under it. But this one dates to the time of Solomon. And it just shows you storage, government storage. What were they storing? Probably food, but it's hard to know. The food, of course, was not for the common people. The common people ate food that they raised themselves. Well, who was the food for? Well, for government workers who have important jobs, telling regular people how to live their lives. And they have to be provided with plenty of food. And there it is. This is exactly what Samuel warned the people of Israel about, which is part of the fun. Okay. Solomon divided the country up into administrative districts, which is really a fascinating thing. The administrative districts were based on the tribal districts. And then within tribal districts, they were set up on districts that surrounded administrative centers or district offices. And so Hatzor was the headquarters of an administrative district. And we have lists of all of Solomon's various governors and administrators and keepers of the oil and keepers of the donkeys and whatnot from all over Israel. It was a large, well-oiled center. One of the most important functions of the various government administrative centers was the collection of taxes. And taxes were normally paid in kind. So people would bring jars of oil or sacks of grain or whatever, herds of sheep. And these would be just brought in. And of course, this was going to government storage. And government bureaucrats would be paid to keep track of the oil and the wine and the grapes and the wheat and the goats and whatever came in, and to dispose of it, to sell it back to the people or whatever they were going to do with it. The centers, places like Hatzor, are called royal cities. This is a term that is in common use all over the ancient Near East. The Mesopotamians used a similar system. The Sumerians apparently did this. The earliest Sumerian pictograms are government notes about tax receipts. So the Sumerians did this, the original Babylonians did that, the Assyrians did this, the Neo-Babylonians, the Persians all did this. The Egyptians divided Egypt up into nomes, separate governors in each region for the collecting of taxes, the maintenance of facilities, and all of this stuff. So what we see Solomon doing in Israel fits exactly into the broader pattern that we find in the ancient world. Just a common thing. Okay. Solomon has some external affairs. Solomon's trade relationships are fascinating. The most important ones seem to have been to the south, out of Eilat or Aqaba, the Gulf of Eilat or Gulf of Aqaba. We call it whichever, depending on whether we're Israeli or Arab. The Arabs like to call it the Gulf of Aqaba, named after the little town of Aqaba, which is right next door to Eilat. The photograph on the right is the Gulf of Eilat. It is very pretty, but it's also important for trade. The city of Eilat, which you can see on the left there, lower left is shopping center on a beach. You can see the hotels. But the most important thing that's going on at Eilat is the shipping. It's a very, very important port city for modern Israel. It's possible to get into Israel from the Indian Ocean and therefore from the Pacific Rim without going through the Suez Canal. So Eilat is a very important port city. It was in Solomon's time as well. And so international trade came through the Gulf of Eilat. It's fascinating that there's very little trade in the ancient period that went out into the Mediterranean. Israel was never very interested in trading with the West. They traded with Egypt, they traded with the Indian Ocean. As far as the Pacific Rim, it's very likely that Israel traded with at least some merchants as far away as the Philippines. We don't have evidence of that, but there's no reason that they wouldn't have. Those boats would go around the shore of the Indian Ocean and would eventually come as far as Eilat. The little jars in the upper left-hand corner are called bilbills. These were used for the shipment of perfume and expensive oils. When you find something in a bilbil, it's not cheap. This is something very expensive. And you'll notice that bills all have a little list. They're ever so slightly out of plumb, not straight up and down. They're fascinating. We don't know why bills were made the way they were, but they're all made the same way. Every bill we have has that a little bit of a tilt to it. We don't know why. We think maybe something to do with letting air into the pouring spout. We don't know. It's just kind of fun. The artifacts of the world trade through the Red Sea are found all over Israel. The Bible claims that Solomon's contacts were worldwide, and I'll put quotes around that, but they were definitely international, and it came from a long way off. The Queen of Sheba was probably the wife of a trading partner who was interested in Solomon's government and his economic techniques. Sheba is in Arabic called Seba, S-E-B-A, and that is the modern state of Yemen in the lower left corner of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Sabah was a maritime trading country from way back, and there's good evidence for Sabah all the way back to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. The Queen of Sheba is actually the Queen of Sheba, and her job was as a diplomat, which is fascinating. It's quite possible that the king of the Arabian people group of Sabah was concerned that Solomon's shipping would perhaps interfere with his caravan routes or something like that. And he sent his queen to investigate. It's striking that Arabian queens disappear from the public history about 700 BC. Prior to about 700 BC, it seems fairly common. We find it in the Egyptian literature and in the Mesopotamian literature that queens from the Arabian states would act as ambassadors. So the Queen of Sheba is very likely acting as an ambassador from her husband, the king. And what the Queen of Sheba was doing in Israel was to find out who Solomon was and where he was making all his money, finding out if maybe there were some business deals they could agree to, something she could learn from him that they could put to work in the Yemen. It's a perfectly reasonable business and diplomatic mission. And of course, I shouldn't have to mention, Hollywood gets it completely wrong. They assume that the Queen of Sheba was one of Solomon's wives. That's silly. It would never have happened that way. She was already a queen. She was married to somebody else. It would have been a diplomatic faux pas of the greatest sort for Solomon to have taken this woman as a wife. So it didn't happen, but the relationship happened, and the international connection definitely did happen. It is interesting that the Queen of Sheba fits into a period before 700 BC. There are those who argue that the Old Testament history from Joshua through the Kings was actually written at the time of the fall of Jerusalem, before the fall of Jerusalem. They believe that the book of Deuteronomy was actually written at the time of Josiah, just before the fall of Jerusalem, and that the history of Israel was invented at the same time. That's not true. It simply isn't true. The so-called Deuteronomist would not have invented a Queen of Sheba on diplomatic mission because he wouldn't have known of such a thing. The liberals have trouble making it up as they go along. It's always difficult to tell a convincing lie. The nice thing about being a Christian is that we're allowed to tell the truth about our beliefs. We could talk about the Queen of Sheba and then go look for the evidence. There she is. Does it matter? No, not at all. Your salvation doesn't matter. It doesn't depend on believing in the Queen of Sheba. But isn't it nice to know that the biblical story is a sequence of facts? including a whole bunch of facts that don't matter. Even the facts that don't matter are true. Okay, let's go on with a couple more. We'll finish up Solomon today. Solomon's diplomacy was not simply with Arabia. He had relations with much of the ancient world. And as I've mentioned before, many of these relationships were sealed with the giving or the taking of daughters in marriage. The relationship with Hiram of Tyre was a very good thing and profitable for both men. The result of that one was the construction of the temple. The seal of that alliance was apparently a Phoenician princess. 1 Kings 11:1 tells us that Solomon was given a princess from Tyre, a daughter of Hiram. In 1 Kings 3, we're told that he made an alliance with the Egyptians. And this was also sealed with a daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. There are other references to this marriage. To think that an Egyptian princess would be given to a foreigner is absolutely amazing. The Egyptians normally didn't do this, but apparently this is what happened in Solomon's case. So this is a particularly significant relationship that Solomon made with Egypt. Ancient kings had the idea that this was a good thing. If you had a rival, you make a marriage, give a daughter, give a son, whatever. A man is unlikely to attack his father-in-law. Just simple enough. It had the side effect of producing gigantic harems. This was always trouble. Solomon had a problem with multiplying wives and horses, which Deuteronomy specifically says you're not supposed to do. The problem is not so much that horses are not fun to have, or that having a lot of wives is troublesome, as that the reliance on secular visions of international security is just wrong. It was the wrong way to do diplomacy, but it's the way it actually was. And one thing that makes me believe that the Bible is telling us the truth is that the Bible doesn't hold back on the stupid things that ancient people did. Giving a daughter in marriage to a rival king, to us today would seem like the stupidest thing you could possibly do. In the ancient world, this was common. And the Bible just tells us that. Okay, where did the wealth come from? It came from a lot of places. International trade, caravans over land, and ships throughout the world took advantage of the fact that the great powers were in a time of eclipse. Egypt and Mesopotamia in particular were not very important. And it was possible for Solomon to make trade agreements with people all over the place. Secondly, the corvée. Corvée is kind of a draft. So Solomon, as the king, could say, from this town of so many people, I want every year a certain number of young people to become career workmen for the state. And you will build roads or build walls or collect taxes or whatever. It's a draft. Levy is when a certain number of people were taken for a specific task. So the gate at Hatzor needs to be rebuilt. That's a short-term project, take several months perhaps. And so from the surrounding area, the king could simply say, I want 10,000 men to come and do this job for me. And he was responsible uh, to support them. They had to have food and housing while they were doing the job, but they certainly weren't getting rich. They didn't become government bureaucrats, they became simply slaves for the period. So the corvée and the levy were two ways of Solomon getting all the public works um, support that he needed. He could also build an army, a standing army, complete with chariots and all of the trimming. Solomon's projects were enormous, even by modern standards. When we look at the percentage of the gross product, the gross domestic product of Israel at this time, Solomon used up most of it in gigantic public projects. The temple is the least of them. These were paid for by the confiscation of large portions of the income of the productive sectors of Israel's economy. So people who did their own work on their farms or in workshops, whatever they did, had to pay a large portion of that in order to support the government. Later on, this becomes a problem. This will lead to the split of the northern and the southern kingdoms. We see the evidence of this in the archaeological record. The tremendous scope of Solomon's projects. It was an enormous thing for the time, or in proportionally, even in modern times. Okay. During his last years, Solomon was dragged aside by the pagan connections of his wives. These are a couple of images that you've seen before. The pagan idols, the idolatry, the fertility cults, all of the rest of it. Solomon put up with a lot because his foreign wives never became Israelites. They were free to practice their own religions and to raise their families to practice their own religions. This was one of the things that would eventually prove to be the downfall of Israel. So Solomon, Solomon was a wise man, but he was also a man with a lot of faults. Most real people are a combination. Solomon made a lot of errors in judgment, but he was also a scholar who collected the wisdom of other cultures and also maintained a scholarly community in the royal court. And this led to Solomon collecting Proverbs and writing the Song of Solomon and writing the book of Ecclesiastes. This character on the right is a Sumerian statue of a wise man. And it looks like he's in some kind of a leaf-built kilt. We don't know. But the wise man was a fixture in the ancient society. A wise man was a learned man. He is a scholar. He could read and had read as much as he could get his hands on. He was something of a Gandalf character, whose job was to help the ordinary people understand the logic and ethical implications of the practical decision making that they would do. Solomon's wisdom grows out of a commitment to a broader and deeper scholarly presence in court. When we get together on Monday, we're going to look at the division of the kingdom. And by that time, I hope I will figure out why my hyperlinks aren't working, which would be a great fun thing to know. At any rate, here we are. We'll be back at Let's see here. Slide number 141. I'm just writing this down so I'll remember it. We'll be back with another sequence on Monday. I hope this is helpful. It's fun for me, and I'll try to get the technology working better. It's always a challenge, but at the same time, here we are. Hello in the Philippines, goodbye in Italy, and all over this country. It's good to see everybody. Thank you all for coming.
you.
We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jan.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Love you guys. Bye-bye, Oscar. Bye, Don.
Bye.